everybody, and this is part 4 of our Tamiya Corolla build. In this video we'll be covering the construction of the chassis for the car, which will include the drivetrain, transmission and suspension components. But we're starting off with the masking and painting of the heat shielding around the prop shaft area of the car. The paint being used is Mr. Hobby super stainless steel, which sprays really well out of the airbrush. It really needs very little thinning to get a very shiny effect on the part. And we also use that for the exhaust system, just painted all one colour that's previously been primed with some Alclad grey primer. The Mr. Hobby paint doesn't really require a gloss black, and it goes on perfectly well over a grey, matte grey primer, as you can see there, and gives a really nice finish, stainless steel for the exhaust. There's obviously lots of masking on these cars in general, but on some of these rally cars in particular. So we've masked off the engine elements there in those shots and sprayed it black overall. We're going to come back and do some more detailed painting with some different colours for the actual engine itself, leaving the gearbox in black. While we've got the paint out, we've done the uprights, painted the uprights there in aluminium, together with the disc brakes, ready for some detailing later on in the build. You see that later on in the video. We've also done the started with the transmission and painting the differentials in black. Now we're going to move on to masking some elements just to the back of the chassis there. Two boxes, I don't know what they are particularly, just some sort of moulding there which needs masking off and painting in silver. These cars really do take quite a bit of masking off. You can hand paint them, but for areas, particular metallic areas, I like to spray them, and it's probably worth it for me to make the effort of going into some of this masking, even though it's quite intricate. Really, it's just a case of being methodical and working around the part. Obviously, this element of the video speeded up quite considerably. So it's just a case of working around, making sure that each piece is properly burnished down and sealed. And plenty of tape around the spray area, even though we're using a fine tip on the airbrush. It's very easy to get overspray beyond the area that you're painting, so plenty of masking tape to be used at this stage. So those are the two elements that we're wanting to be painting in silver. They're already done, and we'll be moving on to masking off the area around the engine where we want to paint the engine block, the sump, in an aluminium colour. So we're masking off the gearbox at this stage, which will remain in the semi-gloss black that we painted earlier on. I think this part was even more fiddly to mask than the previous bit of masking there. But again, it's just a case of working around using very fine strips of masking tape to get that job done. And just being methodical about it, working round, and eventually you'll find that the job's done. So coming towards the end of the masking process there. Again, plenty of masking tape to avoid any overspray. If we do get any overspray, it's fairly easy to polish some of these paints off the very gloss white finish there. So the airbrush is loaded up again with Mr. Hobby. This is super fine silver, which is fairly new paint, but it really does give a nice finish, particularly on a gloss white base. The only problem I found with them was that the finish is quite fragile and does rub and scratch quite easily, so this area did subsequently need a couple of touch-ups for scratches and little marks that turned up during the rest of the construction. Even though we've used plenty of masking tape on this part, I still managed to get some overspray, but as I said, because of the very gloss nature of the white, it was easy to polish the aluminium and silver paint away and clean the finish up. We do the top and bottom of the engine in the aluminium. Not a lot of it's going to be visible when the front suspension is fitted to the car, but while we've got it in this stage, it's just as well to try and cover as much of it as we can. So after all that work, it takes just a few minutes to spray the colours and remove the masking and check how we've done with our masking work. There's generally, with such a complex piece of masking such as this, it's often the case that there is elements of overspray, but they're easily tidied up. And there's some areas that perhaps have been missed, and I think I went round subsequently around some of the black areas and touched them in just to finish the painting off and neaten the edges up. So off comes the masking tape, and we've got the result we wanted. There's a bit of brush painting to do in black to the rear of the right hand aluminium section there, but that was brush painted. I didn't want to mask over the very delicate silver finish that we just achieved on that, so it was left as it is. So before we move on to fitting the transmission, there was just one job that needed doing, which was to fit some Kevlar decal to the centre of the prop shaft. I imagine that, I think it's some sort of not a differential, but some sort of gearbox in the middle there that was covered with a carbon Kevlar housing. So that's just been replicated with some Scale Motorsports carbon Kevlar sheet. I did have the Scale Motorsports carbon set for this kit, but it was a very old acquisition of mine, and when I came to use it for this build, the decal sheet had dried and cracked, so it wasn't usable. There is a template, however, on the back which I did use to copy it onto a new sheet of Scale Motorsports carbon Kevlar decal, and used it to cut out the some of the patterns for the Kevlar detailing and carbon fibre detailing on the car. Later on in the build, you'll see some of that around the seats and so on. So there is some care needed with the Scale Motorsports decal. It's very thin, but the benefit of that obviously is that it conforms very well to a lot of the moulded detail. The technique is just to lay the decal down over some microset, which is the blue bottle at the top there, and gradually work it down onto the model around the detail. You can see we're doing that now just with a soft brush, and the decal really reacts well to a source of heat. So I've got a heater in the modelling room that I use, and if you just wave the part in front of the heater, you'll see the decal shrink around the moulded detail. This is a Decals, obviously oversized. It was trimmed to the shape of the part later on. So going on to the rear differential, it's been painted in Tamiya's lacquer paint in the semi-gloss black with some titanium gold detailing, and we're just putting some bare metal foil just to substitute for the silver paint that Tamiya call out for on the band around that particular part of the differential. One thing you might notice is that the half shafts are missing from the differentials. They're actually in the kit, they're moulded to the front and rear differentials, but I managed to break one off earlier on in construction. So I ended up cutting all the half shafts away from the differentials together with the rubber boots that are moulded in as part of one, and they were subsequently replaced. You'll see later on in the build they were subsequently replaced with some nickel silver rod. So going on to fitting the rear diff here, just making sure that it's going to fit properly before we commit to any cement. Just using some Revel Contactor Professional cement for this. Just one location point under the diff. I didn't glue the front end. It's solid enough without any cement at the front. And the front diff going in there, which is quite a tight fit over the moulded part of the gearbox. But all the better it holds in nice and firmly. And then the exhaust system, which we've seen painted earlier on. A lot of the transmission and suspension goes over the exhaust system, so that needs fitting at this stage. Goes in very easily and just accentuated with a drop there of Tamiya's black wash just around the bolt heads, and obviously in the exhaust outlet at the back there, just to add a sense of depth. So again, going back to some Mr. Hobby aluminium to spray the uprights, which obviously include the spring elements there, which will come to detail paint in a moment. The Mr. Colour paint goes on really well with some lacquer thinner, their own brand lacquer thinner, and we're using that on to spray the discs as well, all 4 discs. And again, they'll be detail painted in a while, together with some photo etch to go on those as well. So we'll see that before the end of the video, ready for fit into the car. So a good few coats of the silver going on, nice finish on those. And the rear discs still on the sprue there. The attachment points are actually on the calipers at the back, so they're going to be painted a different colour, so they can be removed and the sprue points cleaned up without damaging the paint that we've just applied. So this is going on to the detail painting of the uprights, starting off with there are some cylinders. I'm not quite sure what they are, but the Tamiya instructions call out for a titanium gold colour, so that's what we're using. It's again a Tamiya lacquer colour, lacquer paint which paints very well straight from the bottle. And going on to the springs, these are quite fiddly. They do take quite a bit of patience to get a neat finish on the actual coil springs. The front ones are painted in red, and the rear ones in blue, as we can see here starting off. This is one to take your time on, really, just to make sure that you do get a neat finish. Although when the parts are actually fitted to the car, they do get buried quite a way down into the wheel arch, so it's very difficult to see all but the very top of the coil spring. There's also a very large ejector pin in the middle of the spring, which you could take out if you wanted to, but I left them in. I felt that it was a lot of work for what would be fairly invisible. So some Tamiya lacquer metallic grey for the calipers. All 4 calipers are painted in the grey colour. So again, it's a thin paint straight out of the bottle. It's great for brush painting. I don't thin them anymore at this stage, just a good shake, and what's left in the cap is good enough to paint the model with. So moving on to the rear suspension, the subframe element, which has got the rear anti-roll bar. Again, that's been painted in gloss white with some semi-gloss black, and now just a couple of little details being picked out with some titanium gold. This is quite a structural element, so we need to make sure that this is fitted very securely when we come to do that. Just a quick clean up before it goes onto the model. I like to make sure that all the parts are pristine before they are actually fitted on to the final model. And just check where the location points are. Refer back to the instructions before fitting the parts. There are lots of location holes on the chassis pan, and it's just important, obviously, to get the right ones. Some of them are quite close together and can be confused, so just a quick check before we commit to any cement. Again, doing that with the rear subframe there. So we've got the right location points, just a dab of the Contact Professional, and it will actually burn through. It would be ideal to take the paint off, but it does. I find it does burn through the paint, and it gives a secure enough bond. So that's the rear subframe being fitted. A lot of this detail would be covered up. There are some stone guards to be fitted underneath the car. There's one at the front, one at the back, which protects the differential units. But Tamiya mould those in transparent plastic. And later on in the build we'll see how they were treated. To avoid covering all this detail up, I actually left those in transparent and just applied some Kevlar decal to them. We'll see that at the end of the build how that turned out. I just didn't want all this work to be covered up. So the front upright's going in, and we've seen the steering gear in there as well. Just checking the fit of the front subframe. The location points are right in the middle of the part. Actually, they're not where you'd expect them to be at the front or the back, so just a quick double check to make sure that it's going in the right position. And the front roll bar fits in fairly simply, just 2 location points. And again, using the contactor to secure the roll bar into place. So it's starting to come together now. There was some bit more detail painting to do, which I've not covered in the video, but it was just for, I think it's the battery actually at the front of the gearbox there, which is painted in a tan colour. That was just done in with a brush. Just a bit of clean up for some overspray that we noticed later on. So ready now for the rear suspension, the rear uprights and the discs to be fitted. I'll be coming on to those in a moment. Quick look at the work done so far. I do like a clean finish on my car models. A lot of people do a lot of weathering on them, but I like them neat and tidy, as you can see in this shot. So I mentioned earlier on that the half shafts were, well, I managed to break one of them, so they were all replaced with some nickel silver rod. That also involved removing the boots from the rubber boots from the ends of the parts and drilling those out together with the ends of the differential units. Obviously these nickel silver rods have got to be exactly the right length to make sure that the uprights locate correctly. The front ones obviously need to rotate around the boot, so no cement is used on those. So there's the half shafts being fitted and the front uprights locked around them. Bit fiddly, but it all comes together in the end. You can see there that we've painted the battery that I mentioned earlier on at the front of the gearbox. The rear half shafts is the same process really. You'll see that I had to remove the rear subframe to get this all to fit together. And by this stage I'd cemented the uprights to the subframe to make sure that everything lined up properly. It was just a case then of stretching the uprights around the half shafts to get the whole thing to come together. So a bit of fiddling around now to get the subframe back onto the car. Just working round. There's several components that need to actually fit into place all at once. So it's, as I say, a bit fiddly to get this to come into place. Tweezers required just to locate the shafts in there. So going on to the discs, they were painted sprayed in silver earlier on, and now we're going to actually add some etched steel discs from the Scale Motorsports etch set. Just tiny little dabs of super glue being used for this. I think the Tamiya instructions suggest that the discs are painted in a metallic grey colour, which is probably correct, but I like the look of the etched steel discs through the wheels, so I'm going to leave them like that. Probably not absolutely accurate, but I just think they'll look nicer through the wheels. So just being careful not to mark the paintwork. Tiny drops of cement using a wooden toothpick there, and using the same toothpick just to press the part down into place. We're using a thin super glue so the bond is fairly instant on those. Coming on to fit the brake discs now, and it's Tamiya's trademark poly caps being used. and obviously they need to rotate inside the hub of the brake disc, so we need to keep the glue well away from those poly caps, although the poly caps themselves are quite difficult to lock into place because of the material that they're made out of, but even so we try and keep the glue away from them. So there I just pop it into the hub, and again some tiny dabs of CA around the outside of the brake disc where it won't come into contact with the poly cap, but it'll still give a good bond to the upright. We don't want these pulling away with the wheels in case we need to take the wheels off. The wheels will be applied to the model just to have the model something to sit on rather than sitting on all this chassis work later on. So the wheels will need to be removed and refitted, so it's important that these are really strong locations onto the uprights. One of the last jobs now is to fit there are two bars which locate the rear suspension in place. They're painted a quite an unusual green colour according to the instructions, so that's what we did, and they locate fairly straightforwardly onto the rear suspension. Make sure that they located properly. It's one side, both sides done now, and just a little bit of detail painting in semi-gloss black just to match the rear wishbones. Again, using a very fine brush and the Tamiya lacquer semi-gloss black paint. I think I mentioned earlier that these are expensive Sable Winsor & Newton brushes, which are obviously looked after. They're kept in their protective covers to make sure they stay in good condition. And we're just about there now with the chassis. Let's call that done, I think. So some overall shots of the work that we've done to the chassis. As I said, they've got some stone guards to be fitted later on, but we'll come back to that in a subsequent video. Probably one of the finishing videos that we're going to do on this particular build. So we've got a nice neat result there. So that's it for the chassis. We're pleased with the result of that. In the next video we're going to be assembling the interior. We've previously prepared all the parts for that, but in the next video we'll be putting that together with building the seats and the dashboard. So to pick up the next videos in the build, if you want to subscribe to the channel, please do. Thanks for watching this one, and we'll see you in the next part 5. Bye bye for now.